The smell of burning pine and something worse drifted across Chatham County for 3 weeks in the summer of 1859. People in Savannah, 11 miles east, claimed they could taste ash in their well water. The charred cross stood visible from the river road until November rains finally toppled it into the blackened foundation where 17 bodies had been found fused to pew wood and floor planks. The official inquest called it a tragic accident. A lantern kicked over during Sunday service, doors jammed by panic and poor construction. Reverend Samuel Cross, the black preacher who tended 3 plantation chapels in the district, had perished alongside the white planters and their families who had gathered that morning. He was listed among the dead, though no one could say which set of remains belonged to him. But the enslaved people who lived in the quarters behind Ashford Plantation told a different story. They said Reverend Cross had walked away from that fire. They said he had locked those doors himself, and they said he sang while it burned. Reverend Samuel Cross was not ordained by any seminary or conference that would acknowledge his existence in their records. He had learned scripture from his mother, Dinah, who had learned it from traveling Methodist circuit riders who sometimes stopped at the quarters on Saturday evenings before the War of 1812. Dinah could recite the entire book of Exodus from memory. She taught Samuel the same passages, along with others she selected carefully. The meek inheriting the earth, the last becoming first, Pharaoh's army drowning in the sea. By 1843, when Samuel was 30 years old, he had earned a reputation across 3 neighboring plantations as a man who could preach fire and comfort in equal measure. He had been purchased at auction by Jonathan Ashford specifically for this purpose. Ashford owned 200 enslaved people across 1,700 acres of rice fields and timber stands. He needed someone to keep them calm, to remind them that suffering in this world bought salvation in the next, to channel their rage into hymns instead of rebellion. Samuel preached at Ashford Chapel on Sunday mornings. At noon, he walked 4 miles to Wilmington Plantation, where he held service in the barn for the 70 people William Pritchard owned. By evening, he reached Mercy Hill, the smallest of the 3 properties, where 30 enslaved people gathered in a clearing under the live oaks. Thomas Delaney, who owned Mercy Hill, provided nothing but permission. Samuel stood on a stump and preached until dark. The arrangement suited everyone. The planters got a reliable mechanism for social control. Samuel got something more valuable than wages. He got access to 3 communities, 3 networks, 3 sets of ears that heard things masters never intended them to hear. He learned which overseers took bribes, which families planned to run, which white men in Savannah sold, forged freedom papers. He kept these secrets the way other men kept ledgers. In 1856, Samuel married a woman named Ruth, who lived in the Ashford quarters. She was 23, he was 43. The marriage was not legal, but it was witnessed by 200 people who sang when Jonathan Ashford gave reluctant permission for them to jump the broom together. Ruth bore Samuel a daughter in 1857. They named her Dinah after Samuel's mother. The child lived 14 months. Scarlet fever took her in October of 1858. Ruth held the baby while she burned with fever, rocked her while she convulsed, sang to her while she stopped breathing. Samuel was at Wilmington Plantation when it happened. He walked the 4 miles home to find his wife still holding their daughter's body, refusing to let anyone take her. They buried Dinah in the small cemetery behind the Ashford quarters. Samuel carved her name into a pine board himself. He preached her funeral service to 50 people who wept with him, and the next Sunday he preached at all 3 plantations as he always had. But Ruth noticed something had changed in his voice. The comfort was gone. Only fire remained. Winter of 1858 brought news that traveled through the quarters faster than it traveled through the plantation houses. Somewhere in the next county, 8 enslaved people had escaped. They had killed an overseer on their way out, cracked his skull with a shovel before disappearing into the pine forests that stretched for 200 miles. Patrols searched for 3 weeks and found nothing but cold camps and false trails. The escape rattled Chatham County's planters. They held emergency meetings at the courthouse in Savannah. They increased patrols. They restricted movement between plantations, forbade gatherings of more than 5 enslaved people without white supervision, and debated whether to halt Sunday services entirely. Some argued that religious gatherings, even supervised ones, provided cover for conspiracy. Others insisted that religion was the best tool they had for maintaining order, that taking it away would create the very resentment they feared. Jonathan Ashford proposed a solution: a special combined service at Ashford Chapel. All 3 planters and their families would attend, along with the enslaved populations from all 3 plantations. Samuel Cross would preach a sermon specifically about obedience, about the biblical justification for the social order, about the consequences of rebellion in this world and the next. The service would demonstrate unity between masters and their people. It would remind everyone of the proper hierarchy. Ashford presented his idea at the courthouse meeting in January of 1859. Judge Henry Mayhew, who owned no enslaved people but whose wealth came from the cotton factors he ran in Savannah, supported the plan immediately. So did Reverend William Talbot, the white Episcopal minister who served Savannah's wealthiest families. Talbot offered to attend the special service himself, to lend denominational authority to whatever Samuel preached. William Pritchard of Wilmington Plantation hesitated. He was a practical man who cared more about rice yields than religious instruction. But his wife Constance had been having nightmares since hearing about the escape in the next county. She dreamed of fires and conspiracies. She needed reassurance that their people were content, that no similar violence waited beneath the surface. Pritchard agreed to the combined service. Thomas Delaney of Mercy Hill was the last to consent. His plantation was the smallest, his people the least valuable by market standards. He had always treated the enslaved population with a kind of distant neglect rather than active cruelty. He saw the combined service as unnecessary theater. But he also understood politics. The other planters would remember if he refused, would interpret refusal as weakness or sympathy. He signed on. The service was scheduled for Sunday, June 19, 1859, 6 weeks away. Samuel learned about the plan from Jonathan Ashford directly. Ashford summoned him to the main house on a Thursday evening in early May. Samuel stood in the parlor while Ashford sat, a deliberate arrangement of power. Ashford explained what would be required. Samuel would preach for at least an hour. The text would be Romans 13. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Samuel listened without expression. He had preached that passage before, had twisted it into something that offered hidden comfort rather than compliance. But Ashford wanted no ambiguity this time. He handed Samuel a written outline of the sermon's required points. Obedience is godly. Rebellion is sin. Suffering in this life purchases glory in the next. The current order is divinely sanctioned and will persist forever. You understand? Ashford asked. Yes, sir. This is important, Samuel. More important than usual. The other planters will be watching. Judge Mayhew will be there. Reverend Talbot from Savannah. You represent my judgment in letting you preach all these years. I understand, sir. Good. Ashford poured himself whiskey from a crystal decanter. He did not offer Samuel anything. You've been a valuable investment. I'd hate to reconsider the arrangement. Samuel walked back to the quarters that night with the written outline folded in his pocket. Ruth was awake when he arrived, sitting by the fire pit where she was boiling laundry. She looked at his face and knew immediately that something had changed. What happened? Samuel showed her the paper. Ruth could read, though she hid it carefully. She had learned from Samuel during their courtship, stolen lessons by firelight. She read Ashford's outline slowly, her lips moving silently. When she finished, she handed it back, without speaking. I have to preach this, Samuel said quietly. Do you? The question hung between them. They sat in silence while the fire cracked and clothing steamed in the iron pot. Finally, Samuel said, I have 6 weeks. Ruth understood. 6 weeks to decide. 6 weeks to plan. 6 weeks to choose between compliance and something else. Something that would change everything or destroy them both. Samuel began his preparation publicly. He spent longer hours with his Bible, could be seen in the Ashford quarters reading Romans 13 aloud to small groups, asking questions about interpretation. He walked his usual circuit between plantations, preaching his regular Sunday services, but now he added discussions of the upcoming combined service. He told people it would be important, told them their masters expected something special. The enslaved communities received this news with the kind of careful neutrality they had learned to perfect. They nodded when Samuel spoke about obedience. They sang the hymns about endurance and heavenly reward. But in the hours between his visits, they talked among themselves. They noted that Samuel's daughter had died. They noted that Ruth had stopped singing. They noted that Samuel's sermons, despite their official content, had begun including more passages about Pharaoh than about patience. Samuel's private preparation was different. He spent his free hours, what few he had, learning carpentry from a man named Isaac who worked in the Ashford barn. Isaac was 67 years old and had been building things for 5 decades. He taught Samuel how to measure precisely, how to place nails for maximum strength, how to identify which woods were hard and which were soft, which burned quickly and which burned slowly. Why you need to know this? Isaac asked one afternoon in late May. Might need to make repairs, Samuel said. Chapel's old. Isaac looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded and taught Samuel about joinery, about how doors hung, about the difference between hinges that could be removed from outside and hinges that only released from inside. He showed Samuel where to place a bar across a door so that no amount of force from the other side could move it. Samuel also began collecting things. Nothing that would raise suspicion individually, but together they formed a pattern. Lamp oil, which he claimed he needed for reading scripture late at night. Pitch from the turpentine trees, which he said he wanted for waterproofing his roof. Cotton batting from the gin house, small amounts pocketed over weeks, which he told no one about at all. Ruth helped without asking questions directly. She understood what her husband was planning without him speaking it aloud. They had developed a language of glances and silences over their 3 years together. She gathered her own materials. Dry pine kindling, resin, a piece of flint and steel she had stolen from the main house kitchen years before. In early June, traveling Methodist minister stopped at Ashford Plantation. Reverend Josiah Crane was one of the few white clergymen who regularly preached to enslaved audiences. He was not an abolitionist exactly, but he believed that black souls required salvation as much as white ones. He had met Samuel on previous visits and respected his knowledge of Scripture. Crane and Samuel talked in the chapel one evening after the regular congregation had left. They discussed the upcoming combined service. Crane offered advice about managing the mixed audience, about framing obedience in terms that satisfied masters while providing spiritual comfort to the enslaved people who would be listening. "It's a difficult balance," Crane said. "You want to honor the earthly order without suggesting it's permanent. The slaveholder's power is temporary. God's justice is eternal." "What if God's justice comes before the next life?" Samuel asked. Crane paused. He studied Samuel's face carefully. "That's not our decision to make. Vengeance belongs to the Lord." "Does it?" Samuel asked. "Or does the Lord sometimes use human hands?" The conversation ended shortly after. Crane left Ashford Plantation the next morning. He would later testify that he sensed something troubling in Samuel Cross's demeanor, though he could not articulate exactly what. He said he considered warning Jonathan Ashford, but decided against it. He told himself he was reading too much into a few questions, that Samuel was simply processing grief over his daughter's death. What would you do if you suspected a man was planning violence but had no proof, only an instinct? Would you speak, knowing you might destroy an innocent person's life? Or would you stay silent, knowing you might enable something terrible? Crane chose silence. He rode away from Chatham County and did not return. By mid-June, Ashford Chapel had been cleaned and prepared for the special service. The building was small, 30 feet by 20 feet, built of pine board with a shake roof. It could seat perhaps 70 people on rough benches. For the combined service, the enslaved population would stand outside, listening through open windows and the open door. The planters and their families would sit inside, along with Judge Mayhew and Reverend Talbot. Samuel inspected the chapel on Saturday, June 18th. He walked around the perimeter slowly, noted the windows, examined the door hinges. That evening, after everyone else had left, he returned alone. He carried a canvas sack containing the materials he had gathered. He worked by moonlight, moving quickly and quietly. He wedged the windows shut from inside using small pieces of wood jammed into the frames. He treated them with pitch so they would not rattle or draw attention. He placed cotton batting soaked in lamp oil beneath the benches where it would not be visible. He arranged kindling against the walls, disguised as simple storage. He modified the door so that the hinges could be secured from outside with a wooden bar he had crafted to fit precisely. When he finished, the chapel looked exactly as it always had. Nothing visible betrayed what he had prepared. Sunday morning would answer the question he had been asking himself for 6 weeks. Not whether he could do this, but whether he would. Sunday, June 19th, 1859 dawned clear and hot. By 8 in the morning, the temperature had already reached 80 degrees. By 10, when people began arriving at Ashford Chapel, the air shimmered with humidity that made breathing feel like drinking. The enslaved population from all 3 plantations arrived first. They came on foot, walking the roads between properties in small groups. 230 people total. They arranged themselves in the yard around the chapel, found shade where they could, spoke quietly among themselves. Children ran between the adults, too young to understand the tension their elders felt. Ruth stood near the back, holding the hand of a young girl whose mother worked in the Ashford main house. She wore her best dress, faded blue cotton she had dyed herself using indigo from the swamp. She watched Samuel, who stood near the chapel door greeting people as they arrived. His face showed nothing, no fear, no anger, no grief. He looked like a man preparing to preach a routine Sunday service. The planters arrived in carriages. Jonathan Ashford came first with his wife Margaret and their 3 adult children. William Pritchard brought Constance and their 2 teenage sons. Thomas Delaney arrived alone. His wife had died 2 years earlier, and he had never remarried. Judge Henry Mayhew came with his clerk, a young man named Peters who took notes on everything and said very little. Reverend William Talbot arrived last, dressed in full Episcopal vestments despite the heat. 17 white people in total. They entered the chapel, choosing seats near the front. The planters filled the first 2 rows. Their families sat behind them. Talbot and Mayhew took seats near the center aisle where they could observe both Samuel and the congregation. Samuel stood at the front, his Bible open on the small pulpit someone had constructed from scrap lumber decades earlier. He waited while people settled, while mothers shushed children, while men removed their hats and women adjusted their skirts. The enslaved population outside pressed close to the windows and door, trying to catch whatever breeze moved through the building. At exactly 10:30, Jonathan Ashford stood and addressed the gathering. He spoke about unity, about the Christian duty to maintain proper order, about the blessing of knowing one's place in God's plan. He reminded the enslaved population that rebellion led only to suffering. That contentment came from accepting one's station. He introduced Samuel with praise that sounded generous, but carried warning in its edges. Samuel was trusted. Samuel understood his role. Samuel would preach what needed to be preached. Samuel stepped forward. He opened his Bible to Romans 13. He began to read, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers." His voice carried through the chapel and out into the yard where 200 people listened. He read the entire passage without commentary. When he finished, he closed the Bible and looked at his audience. "We are gathered here to speak about obedience," he began. And for 40 minutes, he preached exactly what Jonathan Ashford had demanded. He spoke about submission to earthly authority. He reminded his listeners that suffering purchased heavenly glory. He warned against the sin of rebellion. He used the examples Ashford had outlined: the patient slave in Colossians, the servant in 1 Peter, the obedient followers throughout Scripture. Inside the chapel, the white audience nodded. This was what they wanted. This was why they had invested in Samuel Cross, why they allowed him to move between plantations, why they trusted him with their people. He was performing his function perfectly. Outside, the enslaved population listened with expressions that revealed nothing. They had heard variations of this sermon before. They knew how to nod in the right places, how to murmur agreement when masters were watching, how to wait until later to discuss what they actually thought. But a few noticed something: the way Samuel paused before certain words, the slight emphasis he placed on earthly when he said earthly powers, the way he looked not at the white audience inside, but at the faces pressed against the windows outside when he spoke about suffering and reward. Ruth noticed. She understood that her husband was saying goodbye. At 11:15, 45 minutes into the sermon, Samuel reached the conclusion Jonathan Ashford had outlined. He had delivered every required point. He had justified slavery through Scripture. He had warned against rebellion. He had promised heavenly compensation for earthly suffering. Then he kept talking. "But let me tell you about another power," Samuel said, his voice dropping slightly. "A power that stands above all earthly authority. A power that makes kings into dust and calls the lowly by name." Inside the chapel, Jonathan Ashford shifted in his seat. This was not in the outline. The book of Exodus tells us about a people held in bondage, Samuel continued, held by a power that seemed eternal. Pharaoh's empire stretched across the known world. His armies were uncountable. His will was law. And in the face of that power, what did God do? Samuel paused. No one answered. No one moved. God sent plagues, Samuel said quietly. Water turned to blood. Locusts darkened the sky. Firstborn sons died in their sleep. And when Pharaoh finally released the people he had enslaved, when they walked away from 400 years of bondage, Pharaoh changed his mind. He sent his army after them. 600 chariots pursued the people to the edge of the Red Sea. Reverend Talbot stood up. "Brother Cross, perhaps we should—" "Sit down," Samuel said. His voice had not raised, but something in it made Talbot pause. The white minister looked at Jonathan Ashford, uncertain. Ashford nodded toward the door. Talbot started to move. "I said sit down," Samuel repeated. And somehow, Talbot did. He sat back down, his face pale, as if his body obeyed before his mind could question. "The water parted," Samuel continued. "The people walked through on dry ground, and when Pharaoh's army followed, when those chariots rolled into the seabed, what happened?" He looked directly at Jonathan Ashford. "The water came back. The entire army drowned. Not one survived. And Scripture tells us that God did this so that all nations would know His name, so that power built on bondage would understand that it is temporary, that it can end in a moment, that it can end in a flood or a fire or a single night when everything changes." Margaret Ashford reached for her husband's arm. "Jonathan, we should leave." "Too late for that," Samuel said. He walked to the chapel door. He stepped outside, into the sunlight, and closed the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking shut was very loud in the sudden silence. Inside the chapel, the white audience realized simultaneously that something was wrong. William Pritchard stood and moved toward the door. He tried the handle. It did not move. "It's locked," he said. His voice carried an edge of panic he tried to control. Samuel stood on the other side of the door, facing the enslaved population that surrounded the chapel. 230 people watched him. No one spoke. No one moved. "You will want to step back," Samuel said quietly. "Away from the building. All of you. Now." People began backing away slowly. Some understood immediately. Others followed because the ones who understood were moving. Within 30 seconds, a clear circle had formed around the chapel, 20 feet of empty ground separating the building from the nearest observer. Inside, the white audience was shouting now. Multiple men throwing themselves against the door, the sound of fists pounding wood. Reverend Talbot's voice rising above the others, calling for calm, calling for prayer. Ruth moved to stand beside her husband. She held the flint and steel. She did not ask permission. She simply handed them to him and stepped back. Samuel struck the flint. Sparks fell onto the oil-soaked cotton he had placed beneath the nearest window. The material caught immediately, flames spreading faster than thought. He moved to the next window, then the next. Within seconds, all four sides of the chapel were burning. The smell hit first, pine pitch and lamp oil and something else beneath it, the chemistry of transformation. The fire found the kindling Samuel had arranged inside the walls. It found the cotton batting beneath the benches. It found the dry wood that had stood in Georgia humidity for 40 years, waiting for exactly this spark. Inside the chapel, screaming began. Not words anymore, just sound. The raw animal noise of people who understood they were dying. The sound of fists on windows that would not break, on a door that would not open. The sound of prayer transforming into desperate pleas to a God who, Samuel had decided, was busy elsewhere. Ruth gripped her husband's hand. Tears ran down her face, but she did not look away. Neither did Samuel. They stood together, watching the chapel burn, while 230 people formed a silent witness circle around the perimeter. The fire reached the roof in under 2 minutes. The dry shakes caught like tinder. Black smoke rose straight up in the still morning air, a column visible for miles. The cross that had been mounted on the roof peak was the last thing to catch, and it stood burning against the sky like a terrible beacon, announcing something that had no name yet, something that existed between justice and murder, between retribution and suicide. Inside the chapel, the screaming continued for 7 minutes. Then it stopped. The fire burned for 40 minutes before collapsing inward. The roof fell first, taking the walls with it. By noon, nothing remained but the stone foundation and the charred cross that had fallen into the ruins, lying at an angle across what had been the front door. 230 people stood in the yard, watching smoke rise from the blackened timbers. No one spoke. No one moved toward the building. Children had been taken back to the quarters by mothers who carried them away before the screaming started. Those who remained were adults who had made the conscious choice to bear witness to something that had no precedent in their experience. Samuel had not moved from his position near the door. His hand still held the flint, though the tool was useless now. Everything that needed burning had already burned. Ruth stood beside him, her face streaked with tears and soot, her expression unreadable. From the direction of the main house, shouting, someone had seen the smoke. Overseers were running toward the chapel. Behind them, more voices, the alarm spreading through Ashford Plantation like its own kind of fire. Something terrible had happened. The masters were dead. Samuel turned to face the enslaved population surrounding him. 230 pairs of eyes watching, waiting. He spoke quietly, but in the silence after the fire, his voice carried to everyone present. I did this alone. None of you knew. None of you helped. When they ask, you tell them you came for service as ordered. The doors were locked when you arrived. You heard screaming. You saw smoke. By the time you understood what was happening, it was too late to save anyone. You tried to break down the door, but could not. That is the story. Do you understand? Heads nodded. One after another, the affirmation rippling through the crowd. This was a gift Samuel was giving them. The gift of innocence. The gift of a plausible story that might keep them alive when the authorities arrived, looking for conspirators. Go, Samuel said. Back to your plantations, back to your quarters. Tell the overseers what you saw. Answer their questions. Do not lie about being here, but do not tell them what you witnessed before the fire started. Do not tell them I locked that door. Let them find their own explanations. The crowd began dispersing, slowly at first, then faster as the sound of approaching voices grew louder. Within minutes, the chapel yard was empty except for Samuel, Ruth, and the smoking ruins. The first overseer to arrive was Marcus Webb from Ashford Plantation. He was 40 years old, a man who had worked his way up from field hand to management through loyalty and calculated cruelty. He stopped 20 feet from the chapel, staring at the destruction, his face going pale as he understood what lay beneath those collapsed timbers. What happened? His voice was hoarse. Accident, Samuel said. Lamp oil. Fire caught during service. Where are the people who were inside? Dead. Webb moved closer, looking at the door that lay partially visible beneath fallen roof beams. He studied the remains. Then he looked at Samuel, at his soot-stained clothes, at his position standing outside while everyone who had been inside was now carbon and bone. You were outside when it happened? Yes. Why? Samuel met his eyes. Because I am still breathing. The answer was too honest, too direct. Webb understood something in that moment, something he could not voice immediately but would remember later. He turned and ran toward the main house, shouting for help, for water, for anything that might make sense of what had just occurred. Ruth touched Samuel's arm. You should run. Where would I go? North. The roots exist. People could hide you. And leave you to answer their questions? Leave everyone here to face what comes next? Samuel shook his head. No, I did this. I will not run from it. They stood together, watching more people arrive. Overseers from all 3 plantations, the county sheriff, summoned by a rider who had galloped the 11 miles to Savannah in record time. Dr. Franklin Moss, who arrived with his medical bag, even though there was clearly no one left to save. By 2 in the afternoon, they had begun the work of pulling bodies from the ruins. The fire had burned so hot that identification was impossible. 17 people had entered that chapel. 17 sets of remains lay in the wreckage, fused to wooden benches, collapsed into positions that suggested their final desperate attempts to escape. The sheriff, a man named Thomas Crane, no relation to the Methodist minister who had visited weeks earlier, questioned Samuel immediately. They stood in the yard while workers sifted through ash, trying to separate human from structural remains. You are Samuel Cross? Yes, sir. You were preaching this morning? Yes, sir. What happened? Samuel repeated the story he had told. Special, service, mixed congregation. He stepped outside briefly, perhaps to get air, perhaps because the heat was oppressive. The door closed behind him. He heard shouting from inside. He tried to open the door, but it was stuck, jammed somehow. By the time he understood the building was burning, it was too late. Where did the fire start? Crane asked. Inside, sir. I don't know where exactly. Perhaps a lamp. And you could not open the door? No, sir. I tried. Others tried. It would not move. Crane studied Samuel's face, looking for signs of deception. He saw only exhaustion. You realize how this appears? That you are outside, alive, while 17 white people burned to death inside? Yes, sir. You realize you will be held responsible? Yes, sir. Crane arrested Samuel on the spot. No formal charge yet, but protective custody, keeping him away from the white population that would soon be howling for vengeance. He had Samuel's hands bound and put him in a wagon for transport to the Savannah jail. Ruth watched them take her husband away. She did not weep. She had cried all her tears while the chapel burned. Now she just stood in the yard, surrounded by ash and smoke and the smell of death, and wondered how long it would take for the truth to surface. 3 days, it turned out. That was how long the official story held. Dr. Franklin Moss performed the autopsies in the Savannah courthouse basement. 17 bodies, most too damaged for individual identification. He worked for 2 days, documenting what he could. Cause of death. Smoke inhalation in most cases, though several showed signs of burning while still alive. He noted the positions. Multiple bodies clustered near the door and windows, suggesting attempts to escape. Others collapsed in place, overcome by smoke before they could move. The detail that troubled him most was not in the bodies themselves, but in the physical evidence. He examined the door that had been pulled from the ruins. The hinges were intact. The wood, where it had not burned, showed no signs of damage that would explain jamming. On the contrary, when he tested the mechanism, the door opened and closed smoothly. More curious still, he found burn patterns on the exterior of the door and windows that suggested accelerant had been applied from outside. Splash marks of something that burned hotter and faster than wood alone. He documented these findings in his report, but framed them carefully. Evidence suggests the fire may have been set deliberately. However, the chaos of the event and the extent of the damage make definitive conclusions impossible. The report reached Sheriff Crane on Tuesday, June 21st. He read it twice, then rode to Ashford Plantation to inspect the chapel ruins himself. He brought with him a deputy named William Foster, a young man of 26 who had a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession. Foster found what Moss had missed. In the yard, 20 feet from the chapel, a small pile of items half buried in dirt and ash. Lamp oil containers, cotton batting. A wooden bar that was precisely the right length to wedge across the chapel door from outside. Someone hid these, Foster said. Tried to bury them after the fire. Crane studied the items, or someone planted them, to frame Samuel. Or Samuel hid them himself and got interrupted. The problem was evidence without context. They could prove accelerants had been used. They could prove the door had been barred from outside. What they could not prove was who had done it. Samuel claimed innocence. No witnesses contradicted him. The enslaved population all told the same story. They arrived for service. The door was already locked. They heard screaming. They could not help. Crane questioned them separately. He brought people to the jail one at a time, asked the same questions repeatedly, looking for contradictions. He found none. The story was too consistent, too perfect, which made it either true or very carefully rehearsed. He questioned Ruth extensively. She sat in the sheriff's office for 3 hours on Wednesday afternoon, answering questions while Crane watched her face for signs of deception. "Your husband locked that door," Crane said. Not a question, a statement. "No, sir. 17 people burned to death. Someone locked them in. I do not know who, sir. You were there. You saw everything." "I saw smoke, sir. I heard screaming, same as everyone else." "You are lying to protect him." Ruth looked at Crane directly. "If my husband did this thing you say he did, then he had reasons. My baby is in the ground behind the quarters. Her name was Dinah. She died because Jonathan Ashford would not send for a doctor. He said enslaved children were not worth the expense. When I begged him, he had me whipped for insolence. 5 lashes. Do you want to see the scars?" Crane said nothing. "If Samuel burned that chapel," Ruth continued, "then 17 people died. My baby was one. How many black babies have those 17 people owned? How many have died because of them? You want to talk about murder, Sheriff? Let us count all the bodies, not just the ones in that chapel." The interview ended. Crane had no response that would not make him complicit in the very system Ruth was indicting. He sent her back to the quarters and focused on what he could prove in a court of law. By Thursday, the case was clear enough for formal charges. Samuel Cross was indicted for 17 counts of murder. Bail was denied. The trial was set for August 1st, 6 weeks away. That gave both sides time to prepare and gave the white population time to work through their shock and rage. The mood in Chatham County was dangerous. White families were terrified. If one enslaved preacher could murder 17 planters in a single morning, what prevented others from doing the same? Curfews were instituted. Movement between plantations was forbidden. Sunday services were canceled across the county. Some families began sleeping with weapons. Others sold their human property immediately, accepting losses rather than risk living among people who might be planning similar violence. The enslaved community's response was more complicated. Publicly, they expressed horror at the tragedy. Privately, the story of what Samuel Cross had done spread through the network of quarters and kitchens across 3 counties. It was told in whispers after dark, in coded language during the day. It was passed from plantation to plantation like contraband, like hope, like fire itself. Some saw Samuel as a hero. Others saw him as a fool who had made all their lives more dangerous. Most saw him as something between those extremes. A man who had reached his limit and chosen violence over continued endurance. Whether that choice was righteous or reckless was a matter each person decided for themselves. What united them all was the understanding that the official story was a lie, and that keeping that lie alive was their collective responsibility. If the truth came out, if authorities learned that 230 people had watched Samuel lock that door and done nothing to stop him, the repercussions would be catastrophic. Entire communities might be sold away, families separated, people executed as co-conspirators. So the lie held. Every person questioned told the same story. They knew nothing. They saw nothing until it was too late. Samuel Cross had acted alone, and whatever he had done it in a moment none of them witnessed. The white population desperately wanted this to be true. They wanted to believe the massacre was the act of one deranged individual, not a symptom of systemic rage that might be boiling beneath the surface of every seemingly content enslaved person. So, they accepted the story. Even those who suspected it was false. The alternative was too frightening to contemplate. The state appointed a defense attorney for Samuel. His name was Marcus Wright, 38 years old, a Savannah lawyer who handled mostly property disputes and maritime cases. He had never defended a capital case before. He met Samuel in the Savannah jail on Monday, June 27th, 8 days after the fire. The jail was brick, built in 1822, designed to hold 20 prisoners, but currently housing 43. Samuel was kept in isolation, both for his protection and because the other prisoners, mostly white men charged with minor crimes, had made clear they would kill him if given opportunity. Wright sat across from Samuel in a small room used for legal consultations. A guard stood outside the door. They had 30 minutes. "Did you do it?" Wright asked. No preamble, no introduction. "Do what, sir?" "Lock those people in that chapel and burn them alive." Samuel met Wright's eyes. "Yes, sir." Wright had expected denial. He had prepared arguments assuming Samuel would claim innocence. The direct admission left him momentarily speechless. "Why?" he finally asked. "Because they deserved to die." "That is not a legal defense." "I know, sir." Wright leaned back in his chair. "Do you understand what will happen at trial? You will be found guilty. You will be hanged. There is no possible outcome where you walk free." "I understand, sir." "Then why confess to me? Why not claim it was an accident? Stick to the story the others are telling." "Because you asked," Samuel said simply. "You asked me directly. Seemed wrong to lie." The honesty was somehow more disturbing than the crime. Wright found himself facing something he had never encountered before. A client who felt no need to justify his actions, who showed no remorse, who accepted his coming execution with the same calm he might accept rain or sunset or any other inevitable thing. "Walk me through what happened," Wright said. Not for the trial, for my understanding. Samuel told him. The special service, the requirements Ashford had imposed, the outline he was supposed to follow. The weeks of preparation, the materials gathered, the modifications to the chapel. The sermon that followed the script until it did not. The moment he stepped outside and barred the door. "How long did you stand there?" Wright asked. "While they screamed?" "Yes." 7 minutes. I counted. "What did you think about?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My daughter. Her name was Dinah. She died in pain while her mother held her. No one came to help. No one cared." I thought about that. I thought that every person in that chapel had children of their own. They loved their children. They would have done anything to protect them. And then I thought that they had built a world where my children did not matter, where my wife's grief did not matter, where we were tools that wore out and got replaced. I thought about that, and I listened to them scream. Wright wrote nothing down. Some things were too dangerous to document. "The prosecution will paint you as a monster," he said. "They will say you are proof that enslaved people cannot be trusted, that the social order must be maintained with force, that kindness toward your people is dangerous because it creates men like you. Let them say it. I could argue temporary insanity, grief over your daughter's death, the fever of the moment. It might save your life. I do not want it saved. Why not? Because if I live, they will use me. They will say my punishment proves the system works, that justice applies to all. They will make me an example of how merciful they can be. But if I die, I am something else. I am proof that some people would rather die than endure one more day of this. That is worth dying for." Wright looked at the man across from him and understood he was facing something history had few names for. Not a criminal, not in any traditional sense. Not a revolutionary, because Samuel had no larger plan, no organization, no hope of changing the system through his action. He was simply a man who had decided that the people who built and maintained slavery deserved to die, and that he was willing to be the instrument of that death, even knowing it would cost him everything. "I will defend you," Wright said. "I will do my job. But I want you to understand that I think you are right." Samuel looked at him sharply. "About them deserving to die," Wright continued. "Not about the killing, but about the deserving. Jonathan Ashford owned 200 human beings. William Pritchard bought and sold people for profit. Thomas Delaney looked at suffering and did nothing. They built their wealth on the backs of people they treated as livestock. And when you snapped, when you burned them, you did to them what they had been doing to your people for generations. Just faster, more direct, less plausibly deniable." He closed his notebook. "But I will still argue for your life because that is my job. And you will reject that argument because dying is yours. We will perform these roles until the end." The trial began on August 1st as scheduled. The courthouse in Savannah was packed, every available seat filled with white spectators who wanted to witness justice served. Outside, crowds gathered in the street, held back by county militia in case of disturbance. The verdict was never in doubt. The prosecution presented its case over 3 days. They brought witnesses who testified about the fire. They presented Dr. Moss's autopsy reports. They showed the physical evidence Foster had found. The lamp oil containers, the cotton batting, the wooden bar that matched the width of the chapel door exactly. They called Ruth to the stand. She testified that her husband had been distraught after their daughter's death, that he had been acting strangely in the weeks before the fire, that she feared he was not in his right mind. She lied smoothly, her face showing appropriate distress, her voice wavering in the right places. The prosecution accepted her testimony because it supported their narrative. The defense did not challenge it, because Wright understood Ruth was trying to keep herself alive. They called members of the enslaved population who had attended the service. One by one, they told the same story. They arrived. The door was locked. They heard screaming. They could not help. The testimony was so consistent that one juror later commented it seemed rehearsed to the point of unbelievability. But no one could prove coordination. The defense suggested this consistency actually indicated truth. People who had witnessed something traumatic often remember key details identically. The prosecution's star witness was Marcus Webb, the overseer who had arrived first at the scene. He described Samuel standing outside the burning chapel, his clothes covered in soot, his face showing no emotion. He repeated Samuel's words, "Because I am still breathing." "And what did you take that to mean?" the prosecutor asked. That he knew why he was outside and they were inside? That he had arranged it that way? The defense tried to argue accident. Wright presented the case methodically. Samuel had been preaching when the fire started. The door jammed, a not uncommon occurrence in old buildings. Samuel had tried to help, but the fire spread too quickly. The physical evidence could support this interpretation. The lamp oil and cotton batting could have been legitimate supplies stored improperly. The wooden bar could have been something that fell against the door during the chaos. But the prosecution had one piece of evidence Wright could not explain away. A witness he had not known about until the state called her on the final day. Her name was Sarah Ashford, Jonathan Ashford's youngest daughter. She was 23 years old. She had been sitting in the third row of the chapel that morning, survived the initial fire by staying low where the smoke was thinnest, and been pulled from the rubble barely alive. She had spent 5 weeks in Dr. Moss's care, her lungs damaged, her skin burned, her voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. But she could speak, and what she said destroyed any possibility of acquittal. "I saw him," Sarah testified, her voice barely audible in the silent courtroom. "Before he went outside, he looked at us, at all of us, and he smiled." "What kind of smile?" the prosecutor asked gently. "Like he had been waiting for this, like he was saying goodbye." "And after he went outside, what happened?" "The door closed. We thought he would come back, but then we heard something scraping, something being put in place. My father tried to open the door. It would not move. Then we smelled smoke." She broke down. The judge called a recess. But the damage was done. One survivor, one voice from inside the chapel, one witness who had seen Samuel's face in the moment before he locked them in. That was all the jury needed. They deliberated for 45 minutes. Guilty on all 17 counts. The sentencing phase took even less time. Death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. Samuel showed no reaction. He stood when the verdict was read, thanked Wright for his efforts, and was led back to his cell. Ruth watched from the gallery, her face carved from stone, her hands gripping the railing hard enough to leave marks in the wood. After the trial, Wright visited Samuel one final time. They sat in the same consultation room where they had first met. "Sarah Ashford survived," Wright said. "I did not know. No one told me." "Would it have changed anything?" "Your defense, perhaps, but not the outcome." "No." "Then it does not matter." Wright pulled a flask from his coat and took a drink. He did not offer any to Samuel. "I keep thinking about what you said, about choosing to die rather than let them use you. I understand the logic, But I cannot stop thinking about Ruth, about the people in those quarters. What happens to them after you are gone? They survive, same as they did before. With more restrictions, more suspicion. You made their lives harder. I made their lives matter, Samuel said. Every person in those quarters now knows that masters can die, that the untouchable can be touched. That might be worth more than comfort. Or it might be a story they wish they could forget. Samuel nodded slowly. Maybe. I will not know. That is the cost. The execution was scheduled for August 28th, 27 days after the verdict. Hangings in Georgia followed a standard protocol. The condemned man would be held in jail until the appointed day. On that morning, he would be transported to the execution site, given opportunity to make a final statement, then hanged from a gallows constructed specifically for this purpose. The body would remain suspended for 30 minutes to ensure death, then be cut down and buried in the county cemetery's prisoner section. Samuel's case drew unusual attention. Crowds were expected. The sheriff's office coordinated with the militia to maintain order. They selected a site outside Savannah, an empty field that could accommodate spectators while keeping them at safe distance. They built the gallows on August 15th, tested the mechanism on August 20th, using sandbags to ensure the rope would hold. The condemned man's final days became a spectacle. Journalists from as far as Charleston requested interviews. Samuel refused them all. Religious leaders asked permission to minister to him. He accepted visits from only one. Reverend Josiah Crane, the Methodist minister who had spoken with him before the fire. Crane came on August 23rd. They sat in Samuel's cell, separated by bars, speaking quietly. "Do you wish to confess?" Crane asked. "To you or to God?" "Either. Both." "I confess to God every night," Samuel said. "I tell him what I did and why. I ask if he is satisfied with my choice. He does not answer, but he does not need to. I know what I did was murder. I know it was sin, and I know it was right. Those things cannot all be true. Why not? God makes room for David, who murdered a man to steal his wife, for Moses, who killed an Egyptian overseer, for Jael, who drove a tent peg through a sleeping man's skull. The Bible is full of people who killed in God's name or for God's people. Why should I be different?" Crane had no answer. He prayed with Samuel, though the words felt hollow. He left the jail and returned to his circuit, troubled by a conversation that had unraveled every theological certainty he had spent 40 years building. Ruth was allowed to visit on August 26th, 2 days before the execution. She brought nothing. The guards searched her anyway. They gave her 10 minutes in Samuel's cell, watched by 2 armed men who stood outside the bars. They held hands through the separation. They did not speak about the coming execution. Instead, they spoke about ordinary things. The weather, the crops, small details of daily life that would continue after Samuel was gone. It was Ruth's way of telling him that life would go on, that his death would not unmake the world, that she would survive. "I am sorry," Samuel said finally. "For burning them or for leaving me?" "For leaving you." Ruth nodded. "I know, but you chose this. You chose it every moment for 6 weeks, and I understood what you were doing. I could have stopped you. I could have told someone. I chose to let you do it. That makes me guilty too. No one will ever know. I know. That is enough." They sat in silence for the remaining minutes. When the guards said time was up, Ruth stood and walked away without looking back. Samuel watched her go, understanding he would never see her again. and feeling something he had not felt since his daughter died. Not regret exactly, but recognition that some choices cost more than the person making them. August 28th arrived clear and hot. They came for Samuel at dawn. He was transported by wagon from the jail to the execution site, hands bound, flanked by armed guards. The crowd had gathered early, 300 people, maybe more. White families from across the county. Some brought picnic baskets. Children ran between the adults, excited by the spectacle they did not fully understand. The enslaved population was not officially invited, but some came anyway, standing at the edges, watching from distance. Ruth was among them. She wore black, though she was not supposed to have access to mourning clothes. Someone had given them to her. She stood silent, her face showing nothing. Samuel was led to the gallows at 8:30. The structure was simple. A platform, a crossbeam, a rope tested to hold 200 pounds without breaking. A trap door that would drop when the executioner pulled the lever. The fall was calculated to break the neck cleanly, ensuring death within seconds rather than slow strangulation. Sheriff Crane read the charges and the verdict. He asked if Samuel had any final words. Samuel looked at the crowd, at the white faces watching with satisfaction or horror or mere curiosity, at the enslaved people standing at the back, witnessing something none of them would forget. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the field. "I am Samuel Cross. I killed 17 people. I locked them in a church and burned them alive. I did this because they built their lives on the suffering of others, because they believed some people matter and some do not, because they took my daughter from me and did not care. I am guilty of murder, but so are they. The only difference is that my murders were counted and theirs were not." He paused. "I am not sorry. I would do it again. And anyone who continues what they did should know that someone like me is coming for them. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. Because some things cannot be endured forever." The crowd erupted, shouting, curses, some applause from the enslaved people at the back that was quickly silenced by glares from white spectators. Crane signaled to the executioner. The hood was placed over Samuel's head. The noose tightened around his neck. At 8:47, the trapdoor opened. Samuel Cross dropped. His neck broke instantly. He was dead within seconds, body swaying slightly in the morning breeze. They left him hanging for the required 30 minutes. Then they cut him down, placed him in a plain pine coffin, and buried him in the prisoner section of the county cemetery. No marker, no ceremony, just a hole in the ground and dirt piled on top. Ruth watched from the edge of the crowd. When they finished burying him, she turned and walked away. She did not weep. She had no tears left. She simply walked back to Ashford Plantation, to the quarters where she lived, to the life that continued despite everything. The story should have ended there. With Samuel dead and buried, his act of violence concluded, the system reasserting control. But some fires burn longer than the fuel that started them. The smoke from the burned chapel did not dissipate the way smoke usually did. For 3 weeks after the fire, a haze hung over Ashford Plantation, thick enough to taste, persistent despite wind and rain. People claimed they could smell it in Savannah, 11 miles away. Others said it drifted as far as the coast, mixing with salt air until the entire region smelled of burned pine and something darker underneath. The charred cross remained visible from the road until November. It stood at an angle, half collapsed but not quite fallen, like something holding on through stubborn will. several attempts were made to remove it. Work crews sent by the new owner of Ashford Plantation, a Charleston merchant named Reynolds, who had purchased the property at auction, tried to knock it down with ropes and horses. The cross refused to fall. They tried burning the remnants. The wood would not catch, as if it had already given all its flame, and refused to burn twice. Finally, in late November, a winter storm toppled it. But even then, the foundation remained. The charred stone base where the chapel had stood, too heavy to move, too expensive to break apart and haul away. Reynolds eventually built a fence around it, declaring the site unsafe and let vegetation reclaim the space. But people remembered. The enslaved population across 3 counties told the story of Samuel Cross in whispers that traveled from quarter to quarter, carried by field hands who moved between plantations, by house servants who heard their masters' anxious conversations, by children who learned early that some stories were too dangerous to tell openly, but too important to forget. The white population tried to suppress the memory. Ministers preached sermons about forgiveness and proper order. Newspapers ran editorials about the tragedy, framing Samuel as an aberration, an exception that proved the necessity of stronger controls. Legislators in Milledgeville debated new laws restricting enslaved people's movement, forbidding unsupervised religious gatherings, increasing penalties for teaching literacy. But underneath the official narrative, fear spread. Planters looked at their enslaved workers differently now. They wondered what rage might be building beneath the surface of apparent compliance. They wondered if their own people were capable of similar violence. They wondered if kindness or cruelty made the difference, or if the very act of owning another person created a debt that could only be paid in blood. Some families sold their human property and moved west. Others hired additional overseers, increased security, instituted stricter curfews. A few, very few, quietly began making arrangements to free their enslaved workers, though they did so discreetly, not wanting to be seen as weak or inspire others to follow Samuel's example. Ruth continued living in the Ashford quarters. The new owner, Reynolds, kept most of the enslaved population that came with the property. She worked in the fields now, no longer trusted in the house after her husband's crime. She spoke rarely, kept her head down, and survived. But she also became something else, a keeper of the story. When young people asked what had happened that morning, she told them, not the official version, the truth. She described how Samuel had stood outside the burning chapel, how he had watched it burn, how he had counted the minutes while 17 people died. She told them about his final words to her in the jail. She told them that he had chosen death over compromise. Was he right? They would ask. I don't know, Ruth would answer. But he was my husband, and he believed some things are worth dying for. That has to count for something. The question spread, whispered in quarters across the South. Was Samuel Cross a murderer or a martyr? A monster or a man who had reached his breaking point? The answers varied depending on who was asked, but the question itself was dangerous. It suggested that enslaved people had the right to judge their masters, to decide whether their suffering justified violence, to make choices about life and death that the law said belonged only to whites. In 1861, 2 years after Samuel's execution, the nation split apart over the question of slavery. The war that followed killed 620,000 people, destroyed the Southern economy, and ended with the abolition of the institution that Samuel had died fighting against. Some historians would later argue that his execution was one small accelerant among many, that the fear his action generated helped push moderate whites toward extremism. helped convince the North that the South would never willingly abandon slavery, helped make war inevitable. Others dismissed this theory. One execution could not change history, they argued. Samuel Cross was a footnote, a local tragedy with no larger significance, a man who killed 17 people and was justly punished for it. But in the quarters, in the oral histories passed down through generations, Samuel Cross became something else, a story about limits, about the cost of endurance, about what happens when suffering becomes unbearable and options narrow to violence or continued subjugation. Whether that made him hero or cautionary tale remained a question each generation answered for themselves. In 1897, 38 years after the fire, a researcher named Margaret Thornton began compiling oral histories of enslaved people who had survived the antebellum period. She was a white woman from Boston, daughter of abolitionists, who had devoted her life to documenting voices that official records ignored. She traveled through Georgia interviewing elderly black residents, recording their stories, preserving testimonies that courthouse documents and newspapers had erased. In Savannah, she met a woman named Sarah Freeman. Freeman was 71 years old, daughter of Ruth Cross and granddaughter of Samuel Cross, though she never knew her grandfather. Ruth had remarried in 1864 after emancipation, taking her new husband's surname. She had died in 1889, but before her death, she had told Sarah everything about Samuel and the fire. Sarah agreed to speak with Thornton on one condition, that the testimony not be published until after Sarah's own death. Thornton agreed. They sat in Sarah's home, a modest house she owned outright, paid for by 40 years of work as a seamstress, and Sarah told the story her mother had told her. The testimony was devastating. Sarah described how Samuel had planned the fire for 6 weeks, how Ruth had helped him gather materials, how 230 people had watched him bar the door and light the flames, how the enslaved community had agreed to keep this secret, to protect themselves by protecting the lie that Samuel had acted alone. My mother said he was not a good man, Sarah told Thornton, but he was a man who loved his family. When they took that from him, when they made his daughter's life worth nothing, something broke. He decided that people who treated children as property deserved to die, and he made sure they did. Do you think he was right? Thornton asked. I think he did what made sense to him. Whether it was right or wrong isn't for me to say, but I know this. Every black person in this county knows about Samuel Cross, knows what he did, and when they tell the story, they don't call him a murderer. They call him the pastor who said no, who decided his daughter's death would not be for nothing, who made 17 people pay for building their lives on suffering. Thornton published the testimony in 1918, 21 years after conducting the interview, following Sarah Freeman's death. The account appeared in an academic journal with limited circulation. It generated brief scholarly interest, then faded into archives. But the story persisted outside academic channels. Black churches in Georgia taught it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of revenge, but also as a reminder that their ancestors had fought back when they could, that resistance took many forms, that survival sometimes required witnessing horror and remaining silent about what you saw. White historians largely ignored the testimony or dismissed it as unreliable. One 1932 history of Chatham County mentioned the chapel fire as a tragic accident, made no reference to Samuel Cross by name, and moved quickly to other topics. Another 1958 history acknowledged that some controversy surrounded the incident, but concluded that insufficient evidence exists to determine the true cause. The truth was that sufficient evidence had always existed. It simply existed in voices that official history chose not to hear, in oral traditions passed through families, in stories told in quarters and later in homes that Black Georgians owned themselves, in the collective memory of a community that understood some truths were too important to forget, even when forgetting would be safer. The Ashford Chapel site remained empty. The fence around the foundation rotted away. Vegetation covered the charred stones. By the 1970s, most people who drove past on the newly paved highway had no idea anything had ever stood there. The land had been sold several times, most recently to a developer planning a subdivision. Surveyors mapping the property noted historic structure foundation in their reports, but recommended building around it rather than excavating, since the cost of removal would exceed the value of the lot. In 1983, a graduate student named David Ross was researching antebellum religious practices for his dissertation. He came across Margaret Thornton's published testimony while searching through Georgia Historical Society archives. The account of Samuel Cross and the chapel fire captured his attention. He spent 3 months tracking down additional sources: Sheriff Crane's reports, Dr. Moss's autopsy records, trial transcripts, newspaper accounts. What he found corroborated Sarah Freeman's testimony in every material detail. The fire had occurred exactly as she described. Samuel had been convicted and executed. The official story of an accident had been contradicted by physical evidence the authorities chose to downplay or ignore. Ross published his findings in 1986 in a respected historical journal. His conclusion: Samuel Cross had committed mass murder, but the context of that murder, the system that produced it, and the complicity of the victims in maintaining that system complicated any simple moral judgment. He argued that understanding the chapel fire required understanding slavery, not just as an economic system, but as a form of violence so pervasive that it eventually generated counter-violence from those who could no longer endure it. The article generated heated academic debate. Some historians praised Ross for centering enslaved people's perspectives and acknowledging the moral complexity of resistance. Others accused him of justifying murder, of romanticizing violence, of failing to maintain scholarly objectivity. The debate never reached general public awareness. Most Americans, white and black, never heard of Samuel Cross or the Ashford Chapel fire. It remained a specialist topic, discussed in graduate seminars and academic conferences, known primarily to people who studied the darkest corners of American history. But in Chatham County, in the black community that traced its lineage to the enslaved people who had witnessed that fire, the story remained alive. Not as academic history, but as something more immediate. A reminder that their ancestors had faced impossible choices, that some had chosen violence when all other options closed, that survival sometimes meant keeping secrets, telling lies, protecting each other by saying nothing when the powerful demanded answers, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the powerful paid for what they had done. In 2007, 148 years after the fire, a preservation society in Savannah began cataloging historic sites across Chatham County. The project was funded by a federal grant, part of a larger effort to document African American history in the South. Teams of researchers combed through archives, interviewed descendants, mapped locations where significant events had occurred. One researcher, a woman named Angela Davis, no relation to the famous activist but aware of the irony in the shared name, found references to the Ashford Chapel fire in multiple sources. She tracked down David Ross's 1986 article. She located Margaret Thornton's original testimony. She discovered that the chapel site still existed, now part of an undeveloped lot behind a strip mall on Highway 17. Davis obtained permission to examine the site. She brought a small team, 2 archaeologists, a historian, and a documentary filmmaker. They cleared vegetation from the foundation stones. What they found was remarkable. The stones were charred black, even after a century and a half. Beneath the topsoil, they discovered artifacts, melted glass from windows, iron nails fused together by intense heat, and something else: bone fragments. Small pieces of human remains that had been missed or deliberately left behind during the original body recovery. They also found the base of the cross. It had fallen into the foundation at an angle, just as early accounts described. The wood was carbonized, transformed by heat into something harder than stone. When they tried to remove it for laboratory analysis, the wood refused to break. They eventually had to use a diamond saw to extract samples. Carbon dating confirmed the wood came from the 1850s. Chemical analysis revealed traces of lamp oil, pitch, and human tissue. The physical evidence corroborated every detail of the massacre. Davis published her findings in 2009. This time, the story reached beyond academic circles. Local newspapers ran features. A Savannah television station produced a documentary. The National Park Service added the site to its African American Heritage Trail. A historical marker was installed, though the wording went through 17 drafts before all parties could agree on language that acknowledged the violence without glorifying it. The marker read, "On this site stood Ashford Chapel, destroyed by fire on June 19, 1859. 17 people died in the fire, including plantation owners Jonathan Ashford, William Pritchard, and Thomas Delaney. The enslaved preacher Samuel Cross was convicted of murder and executed on August 28, 1859. The incident reflects the violence inherent in the system of slavery and the tragic consequences when human beings are denied fundamental dignity and justice. The wording satisfied almost no one. Descendants of the white families who died thought it was too sympathetic to Samuel. Descendants of the enslaved community thought it was too neutral, failing to acknowledge that the 17 people who died had built their wealth on the suffering of others. But the marker was installed, and the site was preserved, and the story entered public consciousness in a way it never had before. In 2012, a playwright named Marcus Freeman, descended from Ruth Cross through her second marriage, wrote a play about Samuel and the fire. The Cross That Would Not Burn premiered at a small theater in Atlanta. The production was raw, powerful, and deeply controversial. Some critics praised it as an unflinching examination of slavery's moral logic. Others condemned it as exploitative, as trauma porn, as an attempt to profit from historical suffering. The play ran for 6 weeks. Then a national theater company picked it up. It toured to 12 cities over 2 years. Audiences were divided. Some walked out during the scene depicting the fire. Others sat in stunned silence, then stayed for post-show discussions that lasted hours, grappling with questions that had no easy answers. Was Samuel Cross a hero or a murderer? Both? Neither? Did the context of slavery justify his actions? Did 17 deaths balance against the suffering of thousands? Could violence ever be righteous when directed at people who used institutional power to oppress others? What distinguished resistance from terrorism? Where was the line between justice and revenge? The play did not answer these questions. It simply held them up to light, forcing audiences to confront them directly. Some people left the theater convinced Samuel had been right. That extreme oppression justified extreme response. Others left convinced that murder was always wrong, regardless of context. Most left somewhere between those extremes, troubled by the recognition that easy answers did not exist. Ruth Cross died in 1889 at age 54. She was buried in the black section of Savannah's Laurel Grove Cemetery, under a simple marker that gave her married name, Freeman, and made no mention of Samuel. She had survived her husband by 30 years, raised 2 more children with her second husband, and lived to see emancipation and the promise of freedom. Though she also lived long enough to see that promise compromised by sharecropping, by black codes, by the systematic dismantling of Reconstruction. Before she died, she gathered her children and grandchildren and told them the full story one final time. She made them promise to remember, not to celebrate, not to condemn, but simply to remember that their grandfather had reached a point where enduring one more day seemed impossible, and so he chose to end not just his own life, but the lives of the people he held responsible for his suffering. Was he right? Her youngest grandson asked. He was 12 years old, too young to understand the full weight of the question. He was a man who lost his baby and decided that loss would mean something, Ruth answered. Whether that makes him right or wrong isn't for me to say anymore. But it happened. He did it, and we carry that forward. The family carried the story through generations. Some embraced it as evidence of their ancestors' strength and resistance. Others struggled with the violence at its core, troubled by the celebration they sometimes heard from people who learned the story and saw only the triumph of burning oppressors, missing the cost, the trauma, the complexity. By the 21st century, the story had fractured into multiple versions. The historical record was clear. Samuel Cross locked 17 people in a chapel and burned them to death. But the interpretations varied wildly. Some saw it as righteous resistance, a justified response to systemic violence, proof that enslaved people had fought back when they could, and that their resistance deserved recognition alongside more sanitized narratives of quiet endurance. Others saw it as tragedy compounding tragedy, a man so broken by grief that he became the monster his oppressors had always claimed he was, giving them ammunition to justify further oppression. Still others saw it as a Rorschach test, a historical event whose meaning reflected the viewer's own beliefs about justice, violence, resistance, and the limits of moral endurance under impossible conditions. What united all these interpretations was the recognition that the story refused to fade. 160 years after the fire, people were still arguing about what it meant, still wrestling with the questions it raised, still using Samuel Cross as a lens through which to examine their own beliefs about power, justice, and the costs of resistance. The Ashford Chapel site became a pilgrimage destination for some. Black families visiting Savannah would make the drive to the highway pull-off where the historical markers stood. They would stand in the weeds behind the strip mall, looking at the foundation stones still visible beneath decades of vegetation, and think about their own ancestors who had survived slavery, who had made impossible choices, who had lived through systems designed to break them and somehow emerged on the other side. Some left offerings, flowers, coins, small stones as markers of witness. The offerings would disappear, cleared away by maintenance workers or blown away by wind, but more would appear. An ongoing conversation with the dead, with history, with questions that had no resolution. In 2019, on the 160th anniversary of the fire, a memorial service was held at the site. 200 people attended. Descendants of enslaved people who had witnessed the fire, historians who had studied it, clergy from black churches across Georgia, a representative from the Episcopal Diocese offering acknowledgement that white churches had been complicit in slavery and its aftermath. No one spoke for the victims. The white families descended from Jonathan Ashford, William Pritchard, and Thomas Delaney had made clear they wanted no part of any memorial that acknowledged their ancestors as anything other than innocent victims. They saw the service as an attempt to justify murder, to rewrite history in service of contemporary politics, to celebrate a terrorist who had killed 17 people, including women and children. The service proceeded without them. Prayers were offered for the dead, all the dead, those who burned in the chapel and those who suffered under slavery. Hymns were sung that Samuel Cross would have known. Testimonies were read from descendants who carried the story forward. And at the end, the pastor leading the service, a woman named Reverend Gloria Freeman, a distant relation to Ruth through marriage, spoke about memory and responsibility. "We do not gather here to celebrate violence," she said. "We gather to remember that violence was done, that 17 people died in this place in a way no one should die, and that their deaths were preceded by centuries of other deaths, other violence, other suffering that our nation built its wealth upon." Samuel Cross was not a hero, but neither was he simply a murderer. He was a man who reached a point that many of us cannot imagine, a point where all choices are terrible and choosing any of them costs everything. We remember him not because what he did was right, but because understanding why he did it requires understanding the system that broke him. And that system was built by all of us, maintained by all of us, benefited some of us, and we have not yet finished reckoning with its legacy. The service ended. People stood in silence for a moment, then began dispersing to their cars. As they left, smoke from a distant brush fire drifted across the highway, and for a moment, the air smelled of burning pine and something darker underneath. And everyone old enough to know the story felt a chill despite the Georgia heat. The land where Ashford Chapel stood has never been successfully developed. 3 different projects have tried since 2007, and all have failed for various reasons: permitting problems, financing issues, construction accidents that make workers refuse to return to the site. The lot sits empty, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. The historical marker the only indication that anything significant ever happened there. But people still report smelling smoke on certain summer mornings, especially around June 19th. They report seeing a figure standing near the foundation stones at dusk, a tall man who stands perfectly still, watching something only he can see. They report hearing singing, hymns in a language that sounds almost like English, but not quite, rising from the ground where the chapel once stood. These stories are folklore, most likely. The human tendency to impose narrative on random sensory experiences, to find meaning in the meaningless, to make the past present through ghost stories and urban legends. But they persist, and in their persistence, they keep the question alive. The question Samuel Cross asked when he lit that fire and stood listening while 17 people screamed. The question that his execution could not answer, that 160 years of debate has not resolved, that America as a nation still struggles to face directly. What do people deserve when they build their lives on the suffering of others? And who decides when endurance ends and resistance begins? The answers remain as unsettled as the smoke that still seems to rise from that scarred ground on certain mornings, visible to those who know to look for it, invisible to everyone else. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.